What is up, you lovely people? My name is Braxophone, and today we have another Jean guide. I know there's already so many of these on this channel, but I just love her so much. So today we're actually going into something quite strange. We're going to talk about a cryo build for Jean. You guys have heard of Pyro Kuching, Cryo Kuching, you've heard of Pyro Xiangling, and now you're hearing of Cryo Jean. Now the reason this build is weird is because, well, one, Jean's an animo character, so running cryo on her is a little strange, but two, it's absolutely a meme build. This build is not some hyper carry god tier build that you're going to want to use for Abyss 12 necessarily. It's just kind of a really fun thing to mess around with because it allows you to use Jean in permafreeze comps and melt comps as a main DPS. So if Jean's your favorite character to play and you don't care about outputting the biggest numbers possible, this could be the build for you. Or maybe you're just resinless and out of commissions like I was when I spent 2 hours trying to figure this out. But anyways, the core concept of this team requires you to have Chongyun, who is a cryo applicator who actually infuses your weapons with cryo. He's essential to this build, so if you don't have him, you can't really make it function. However, the Hu Tao banner that's coming out in a couple days will feature Chongyun, so you will have the opportunity to pick him up. But alright, let me explain how this team composition works. So again, Chongyun is required, and then you have Jean in your primary DPS slot. To be honest, it doesn't really matter where she is in your party as long as you're using her as a DPS in this composition. This team builds much like a pizza. You can kind of choose what toppings you want on it. So for a lot of this video, I'm actually using Kaya and Jingcho. The reason I chose Kaya and Jingcho is because Kaya's Q allows for high cryo uptime, which is really good for the sets that I'm going to be showing you, and then Jingcho allows us to permafreeze. If you've seen all the Kaya permafreeze builds, this kind of functions similarly, except you get to use Jean, Best Girl, as your DPS. Other flavor options for the pizza though include things like pyro characters or double animo if you feel like it. In this video, you'll also see me use Xiangling as well as a way to constantly melt between Jean and Xiangling. The one downside of this is that the cryo and pyro applications are kind of inconsistent due to Xiangling's timing being consistent and Jean's not being consistent. And for that reason, if you're gonna use Xiangling, I suggest a support build for her, not so much a DPS build, because she will be in the pocket a lot of the time if your only goal is to melt and you want high pyro damage, and maybe a tiny bit of elemental mastery. Going back to the talk about using Kaya and Chongyun together, you do not want to run 2 cryo and a pyro together. That will actually be a waste of cryo resonance because cryo resonance only applies when you have cryo on the enemy. So when you activate any kind of pyro application, you're not going to be constantly getting the 15% crit rate bonus that you would for having cryo applied normally. The reason Jingcho works instead of a pyro unit is because Jingcho allows you to keep the cryo status on the enemies by freezing them. Permafreeze is really strong, so I would suggest running Jingcho and 2 cryo just to make sure that you get the crit rate bonus and so you can get permafreeze going. But if you really love your pyro, pick up a secondary DPS as a pyro character and then run double pyro and 1 cryo unit, which should be Chongyun, and that'll get you your melt. Now that we've talked about team compositions, let's talk about the artifact sets because this is really important for your rotation. Earlier in the video, I mentioned that I took about 2 hours to figure this out, and that's just because I'm an idiot. I was thinking that the 4-piece cryo set would be the best set for this comp. The set's really good, right? It gives you 20% more crit rate if they have cryo on them and 40% more crit rate if they're frozen, so it works great in permafreeze, and it gives you a 15% cryo damage bonus. So I was like, yes, obviously this is the best set. But I was a fool. The answer was right in front of me the whole time. It's a set we've had since launch, and every animo character uses it. This set is the Viridescent Venerer set. For those of you who don't know, the Viridescent Venerer set gives 15% more animo damage bonus, and at 4 pieces, it gives a 40% resistance reduction to the element that was swirled in the last swirl reaction. Jean has Gale Blade on a 6-second cooldown, which allows her to swirl once every 6 seconds if necessary. Considering the fact that Venerer's set lasts 10 seconds and so does Chongyun's E, you should be able to consistently weave both inside of Chongyun's E and between uses of Chongyun's E, since that is on a 15-second cooldown. This means that in this comp, Jean is a combination of cryo damage, animo damage, and fall damage. That's without mentioning that while within Chongyun's E field, you actually get a 15% cooldown reduction if you have Chongyun at Constellation 2. It's not game breaking in this really small window of damage, however, over long battles you'll actually have the opportunity to use Gale Blade more. So with the Viridescent Venerer set, the idea is that you want to constantly swirl cryo damage to get the Viridescent Venerer 4-piece set, which will reduce the enemy's resistance to cryo and make you do a ton more damage. As mentioned previously, you can also use Gale Blade to hit enemies up into the air if they're smaller, so if you're having trouble killing them, you can do that in between uses of Chongyun's E, and you can just do it while you're inside of his circle to swirl the cryo. In this composition, composition, you will also have opportunities for when Jingcho's Q is up, so that way you can use that. Do an Anima Swirl if you have to, because they'll just freeze immediately again when you hit them, so ultimately you are still getting that debuff and you are hitting them a lot harder. One of my favorite things about this composition, even if it is completely 100% a meme, it doesn't require a healer because Jean is already there and her healing output is nuts. In addition to that, if you are running permafreeze, you also have Jingcho heals, which are very small, but they matter. So on screen, if you've been watching, I've been just replaying some of the same clips. These are just clips of me trying to show you the rotation. It's not frame perfect or anything, but ultimately the idea is just, again, Chongyun E, then use Gale Blade to shred the resistance to Cryo, and then hit them a whole bunch because it's fun. Once Chongyun's field is up, you can switch to Jingcho and use his E to try to get some energy recharge, and switch back to Jean, hold E, and get some fall damage from the enemies, and then you can follow that up with another Chongyun E. As far as stats go on the artifacts, it's your standard setup. You want Attack Sands, an Elemental Goblet, and you want crit damage in the final slot if you can use it. The Elemental Goblet in this case is going to be a Cryo damage goblet over an Animo damage or an attack percent goblet. And the reason for this is because most of your damage is going to be coming from Cryo. You do have short bursts of Gale Blade, which really help, but you get the 15% bonus from Viridescent Venerer already. You'll really want the Cryo damage enhancement on this build. The crit damage circlet is completely dependent on the crit rate you're able to get. If you're running the double Cryo permafreeze comp, you can actually forego a crit rate circlet in a lot of cases because you're getting 15% more crit rate, but ultimately if your crit rate is really bad, you do probably want to run a crit rate piece instead of a crit damage piece. You're just going to be missing out on a lot of extra damage if you can't make the crit damage circlet work. Hey guys, post-vid clarity, Brax here. The Cryo set's still incredibly good for this build, and if you're running permafreeze, 40% crit rate is nothing to scoff at. If you decide to go with permafreeze, it's totally fine to build Blizzard Strayer. It's just that the Viridescent Venerer set gives her a little bit more Animo damage and allows slightly more total damage if you have a high crit rate already. The weapons I recommend for this are actually anything that has crit rate as a main stat. For one-handed swords, this is just the Primordial Jade Cutter and the Black Sword. But if you're free to play and unable to get either of those swords, there are still other weapons that are really great. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of Blackcliff weapons in general, but I do think the Blackcliff sword has a lot of merit here because in permafreeze comps, you're usually using those to take out more mobs than just one, so you will be able to get the passive proc from Blackcliff. And outside of that, because Jean has so much healing, you can actually use Harbinger of Dawn. The one downside of Harbinger of Dawn is that the damage falls off in late game, but the crit damage and crit rate that you get from it with its passive are pretty substantial. This would be better suited with someone like Diona instead of Kaya, because if you can get a shield up, then she'll take no damage at all in theory, so you'll always be getting the Harbinger passive. If you decide to run a crit damage weapon instead of a crit rate weapon, you may want to consider switching your circlet over to a crit rate circlet, so that way you're able to get more consistent crits. And if you don't have any of those, you want to go for an attack percent sword. Funny enough, here I'm actually going to count Aquila Favonia as attack percent, because here you're doing a ton of damage based on your attack, even if the main stat is physical damage, so you will lose out on a bit of cryo damage there, but you do get the attack percent bonus and you're doing consistent extra damage due to its passive, so it is really good, and the base attack for it is really high. I think in the cryo build case, Aquila Favonia is probably outclassed by Summit Shaper. Unfortunately, I don't have both the weapons to test that, and I'm really bad at math, but again, if you run Diona, Summit Shaper is going to be really strong. Skyward Blade is actually really good here too, just because of the high base attack. Unfortunately, it doesn't have an attack percent stat like some of the other ones we were talking about, and I know I just said attack percent stat swords, but it just helps provide a lot of extra damage when you get the passive going. The downside is, again, it's not focused on the cryo aspect of the build. Your best bet for attack percent is going to be the flute, and I know it's a gacha exclusive weapon. If you're free to play, you can use Cool Steel. It makes it so that enemies take increased damage if they're affected by hydro or cryo, so that will give you an attack percent bonus passively, and you're going to get that extra damage against them if you refine it, and it is pretty easy to refine. And that should about cover it for this build. It's fairly simple, and again, it is 100% a meme. Like, if you're trying to actually clear the hardest content in the game, it's going to be a little bit harder to do with this build, but it is a lot of fun to use in the overworld and early abyss floors, and if you're having trouble with anything that you need to freeze, it functions perfectly fine. Or again, if you feel memey, you can melt as well. But anyways, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed. I hope you learned something, even if you don't end up using this build. If you've enjoyed this content, make sure to drop a like down below and comment if you have any questions. If you like Genshin Impact content, you can go ahead and follow me on Twitch at twitch.tv/Braxophone, where I'm live a couple times a week, or you can sub to my YouTube. Thanks everyone, and have a wonderful day. Giveaway link in the description.